All right, guys. So you're considering a podcast, you don't know what to expect, and you're ready to plan, you're prepared, you've got an idea in mind, you've never been on camera before, you've never walked into a studio. We're here to help coach you, mentor you, share with you from our own personal experience how to make that podcast come to life, do it well, do it consistently, and find reasons why you're not going to fail at this. So myself, Jerry Sauceda, the host of a longtime podcast, Hype Club Live, part of the Social Plug Media team, and I've got my friend here, Johnny Martinez. What's happening, Johnny?
Jerry, what is going on?
I'm doing well, man. So we've talked about coaching, helping share from our own experience, getting some feedback on the growth of podcasts and why they're so important to business. But I wanted to share some statistics first. When you're considering or thinking, well, why a podcast? Part of your marketing, your branding, whether you're a business, it's your personal story, you're just trying to reach a different audience. But here's some really important key things and statistics that I thought were insightful and helpful in thinking about making that decision. So the number of listeners with podcasts worldwide in the year 2024 is expected to reach 546 million, up 8% from the year before. And we see that growing, especially in the United States. So podcast listeners in the US expected to grow from 75 million to 100 million in 2024. Podcast app usage itself. So top two, Spotify and Apple. Spotify audience expected to grow to 40 million, while Apple Podcasts up to 29 million. You're thinking for yourself, and something we're going to touch on and sharing with you is, what is the genre of your podcast? Who are you highlighting? What are you talking about? Who are you speaking to? The most popular genres, comedy is the most popular podcast genre, followed by news, true crime, and sports. Listening habits. When is your audience actually going to be listening to your podcast? Most of the time it's commuting, working out, doing chores, and just getting their day started. Women listeners are on the rise. So the number of women listening to podcasts is increasing. 45% of women listening monthly and over 32% listening weekly. The industry is growing tremendously. So if you're considering a podcast, for any of those different reasons we just talked about, keep this in mind. By the year 2030, the market size for global podcasting is expected to exceed $131 billion, with rapid growth in video podcasting, where podcast users now, 1 in 3, say that they prefer a video podcast over an audio podcast. And listen to this, Generation Z is saying that 66% would prefer to listen to a podcast than watch television. So that's pretty incredible. All right, so Johnny, going into that, I wanted to ask you some questions in helping someone that is new to getting a podcast started, some of the things they consider, and I'd love to use your show as an example. So as we're going into preparing and planning for a podcast, some of the simple things like coming up with a name that's going to reflect what exactly you're trying to accomplish, and a tagline that is going to summarize very quickly and easily what it is that you're all about. So share with us from your experience more about that, the importance of having a name behind your brand, and then a tagline for your podcast show.
So those are astounding numbers, by the way, on podcasts and the value they're providing to listeners. Those numbers are huge. I mean, we're reaching the billions now.
Right.
And YouTube and Spotify and all those things are great platforms. But the reason why people watch these is because you need a catchy name, just like you said. You need something that people want to pinpoint or go gravitate towards. So we have the Social Plug podcast. And the reason why we came up with that name is because we're all social plugs. We're all socially active, whether we know it or not, through social media or through organic relationships in the community. So we were kicking around the name and we were like, Social Plug Podcast, right? And so what we do is we highlight ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because we're all ordinary people. None of us are above anybody, but we all, when we come together, we have extraordinary superpowers. And what we mean by that is we help people, we help others, we help people level up in podcasting, in business, in life, and beyond. So having a niche market or audience and a name that's catchy is so important because you want people to know and that your podcast is a household name.
Right.
So when you think of the Social Plug podcast, hopefully you think of JRock, Johnny, Jerry, things like that. Not only in New Braunfels, but beyond. So one of my catchphrases is not only highlighting ordinary people doing extraordinary things, but we connect you to level up.
Got it.
Because we plug and we connect you. So part of my intro is when I come on, hey, what's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Martinez. And then you see me do this thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that's all synonymous right there. So talking about the importance of if you're developing your podcast and you're sitting there and saying, I've got an idea, or I'm going to go into recording, having some very small, simple things established like Johnny referred to. What is the name of your podcast that is going to resonate and reflect exactly what you're about? And having a tagline that is going to be a short summarization of exactly what you do. So Social Plug Podcasts, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, connecting you to level up. That in itself probably gives you an idea of what to expect from the platform itself. So taking those things into consideration. Now, next, as far as having the brand established and actually getting into the conversation of the podcast, Johnny, so you mentioned the importance of having an introduction to your podcast. And so this, again, is going to be probably a point where people can expect like, hey, show in and show out. I know that it's going to begin with this piece and it's going to set the expectation for that episode, that show, and what we're about. You've done a great job in establishing an introduction for the podcast that you have. What are some of the parts and pieces that you think are important to include with an intro? And what are some of the things that maybe somebody wouldn't consider, maybe even like a sponsor shout out?
Yeah, so you want to consider just highlighting what your show is going to be about, right? So let's get past the intro. We go about a minute and a half with the intro because you don't want your intro to be too long where people kind of get inundated with it and get kind of bored. But you want to kind of highlight a current event or something like that. So I have the blessing of having our producer on our show. So we kind of go back and forth with some banter. Hey, how are you doing? Whatever. And it kind of sets the tone. Right. And it kind of lets people know what's going on. And one of the things that I do, Jerry, is I say, hey, today's going to be an educational show. Today's going to be an informational show. It's going to be inspirational, so on and so forth. So you want to let your audience know exactly what they are coming into. Right. Right. And then I highlight my guest. So I want to make sure that I introduce the guest. So, before I go into that, you always want to, whenever you go into a podcast, you got to figure out, is it going to be a solo podcast? Are you going to have a co-host? Or are you going to be guest-centric? So on the Social Plug podcast, we are guest-centric. So I want to highlight that guest. And I want to brag on them a little bit. I want them to feel comfortable. Sure. I want them to understand that, hey, we're a team here, and we are going to give value to the audience. Got it. So for instance, hey, Jerry, this guy is an entrepreneur. He's a DJ. He's this. He's a pillar in the community. He's that. And it's going to make you feel pretty good. And it's going to let the audience know who you are. And so when I have you come on and speak, then you're going to kind of be into it, and it's going to be an easier transition for you. Yeah. But those are some of the elements that work for me on my podcast. And usually the intro goes, like I said, about a minute and a half. I go back and forth with JRock about another 30 seconds to a minute, and then I highlight the guest for about a minute. And then we get full-blown into the podcast. Yeah. So those are some things that kind of get the jitters out for the guest, right? And it gets the butterflies, everything out, and then we can get rolling into the real production of the show, which is the meat and potatoes, the actual interview.
Love it, man. So from what I hear you saying, and I've seen this from you time to time, is your intro is establishing the welcome to the show. It's setting the expectation as far as the premise of today's show. You're introducing briefly your guest as well, giving some background, giving some context. And I've also know that you've incorporated this time as well to highlight a sponsor maybe for that show as well. And so maybe those key pieces right there, as you mentioned, might last anywhere from 30 seconds to a minute, maybe a minute, 30 seconds, but it is really going to set the intention for the show itself. Having an introduction is going to be a critical part and piece to your show. Also creates some brand familiarity. I think with people knowing like, hey, I'm going to get that right off the bat. I'm going to know what they're about, and it's going to make it synonymous when people say, hey, I remember what that podcast is exactly all about. So you touched on this, and I do think that this is really important as well when you are going in to establishing your podcast and knowing, okay, are we going to be a podcast that is guest centric, like you mentioned? Are you featuring guests? Are you featuring a topic of conversation? And what is that platform going to look like? So, or is it just going to be a singular focus? Is it the Jerry Sauceda show where I'm just talking with you and I'm giving some of my thoughts, some of my opinions, my experience, and I'm just the talking head part and piece of it, and you see maybe a lot of that as well. So, Johnny, in talking about that, give us, again, from your own particular show itself. So it is a guest-centric focused show. And so what are some of the things that you look for in considering planning on having a guest on the show? Is there ways that you prepare in reaching out or having them reach you to say, hey, let's get a guest on the Social Plug podcast?
So Jerry, that is a very important question, and it's just so much that goes into it. So we want to make sure that we find somebody in the community that is making an impact. We want to make sure that we highlight somebody who has a great story and somebody who can relay that story on a podcast. Because we have some people that have never been on a podcast, so we want to make sure we make them feel comfortable before they even come on. So I have a telephonic interview, and hey, how are you doing? Okay. What are some of the things that you're doing in the community? What are some do's and don'ts that you want to talk about on the podcast? So I do my homework. I do my research. I check out their social media. I check out all these things. Some of their storylines and see if they have videos. So we want to highlight those on the actual show. So recently I had a young lady on the show that she has over 100,000 TikTok viewers.
Great.
And she has a great story where her mom was sick and she grew up in a broken home and all these things. So we're like, what a great story, because now she's an influencer, an entrepreneur, and she makes an impact in San Antonio and beyond with her products. So what a great story that I was able to have with her, and just be able to have her story as another platform, not only from her TikTok, but on our platform as well. And a lot of people were very receptive to it. So the homework that I do is I just talk to them, the research, but I want to make sure that I can pinpoint somebody who can make an influential impact to others. Because ultimately the podcast that we do is we want to help people solve problems with highlighting others and whatever they're going through. We've had some people, Jerry, that have been poor and come from broken homes and have divorces and all these different things, ailments, but they're able to get past those struggles and move on to success. Sure. So those are the things that we want the masses to understand. So maybe they see, like, I can do that as well. Right. I want to be able to take their story and make it my own, where I can either learn from it or build on it. And I don't have to dwell on the negative in my life. Right. I have a chance to get out.
I like that. So doing some of your research, like you said beforehand, so being prepared and knowing if you are creating a podcast that is going to be guest-centric, being able to have a systematic approach in preparing and planning for having your guests on, I think, is important. I've seen with a number of different podcasts where they actually have a prospective guest questionnaire, right? You're going to fill that out. You're going to give maybe more about your background, your experience, your story. They want to make sure that it aligns well with what they're featuring. And I'm sure as you get inundated with guests that want to be a part of your show, you've got to be selective on knowing, hey, who do I feature and how do I plan out the content? So whether, like Johnny mentioned, is looking at the social media presence that they have, the reach that they have, the impression that they give you, having a telephone conversation with them, even if it's just 5 or 10 minutes, can tell you a lot about maybe their personality, their charisma, their ability to speak. That's something that we're going to touch on as well, is sometimes when you're behind the camera for the first time, is being able to be prepared to sound well, sound prepared and ready for a podcast platform. Awesome. So preparing and having guests, also talking about topics. Let's say your podcast is a topic-directed podcast. That is your platform. I'll give you an example of a podcast host and guest that we've got on that does something that is really featured around the senior community and being able to prepare them. Their segments are only 15 minutes long. It's an educational format podcast coming from the perspective of someone who's in that industry, trying to share to a target audience of a family member that is looking to make a decision for their parent, grandparent, someone that they're caregiving for. And so they're only talking about topics that relate to someone in that situation. And it's a very abbreviated segment, but they know like it's intended to be educational about a certain topic, and it's only one voice, just done in audio. So maybe considering that route if you're talking about a topic. Some of the things that I would encourage you to do that I think are going to help give you some ideas on, okay, what exactly should I speak about? Going to platforms and places like search engines, whether that's Google or even TikTok, and simply asking, what are the top 10 to 20 questions that people in this industry have related to this topic? Let's say it's senior caregiving. What are the 20 most common asked questions to a caregiver? That is going to give you the exact direction on topics maybe for your podcast that you want to feature and talk about. Some of the challenges sometimes individuals have is knowing exactly what they should be sharing, what they should be talking about, and who they should be reaching. To that point, I want to bring up 3 key things, and I want to ask you about this, Johnny, with regards to creating a podcast is, 1, knowing your target market. Second is, how do you connect with that audience? And then third, ultimately, what is your goal with having a podcast in the first place? So let's talk about that. What are the importances, Johnny, in going to planning, preparing, and having your podcast done? 1, in knowing your target market. So when I say that, defining a target market, are you just talking to anybody and everybody, or are you really intended to say, hey, I want to have an audience that this is reaching?
I think it's important to know who you're talking to and who you're trying to help solve problems. For instance, if I'm talking to a high school football team, I want to talk about things that they can relate to, known to the unknown. So I used to say that all the time. I want to bring what they know and then give them what they don't know.
Wow, I like that.
So, for instance, we'll go back to the football team. I'm going to talk about perseverance, lifting weights, all these different things, how you can be a better athlete, a better teammate, all these different things. And that's just an example. We can do that in life as well, how to be a better parent, all these things. I don't want to talk about parenting with a high school class. I want to make sure I talk to parenting or about parenting with somebody who has children.
Sure.
So you got to make sure that you structure your talking points and your show or podcast to your audience. If you're trying to sell a product or you're trying to influence somebody on something, make sure you tailor everything to that specific audience. And sometimes it gets diluted because sometimes we're like, what are they talking about? Who are they trying to target?
Right.
But you got to make sure in whatever realm that you're in that you make sure that you pinpoint that specific audience. Like you alluded to the person trying to do the podcast with the nursing home. You want to make sure you talk about things like insurance, well-being for the elderly, all these different topics.
Yeah.
And when you're speaking to a guest-centric on that platform, you want to make sure it's just leisurely conversation. If you have it scripted, people can tell. You got to be able to just talk like you're talking to an ordinary person over lunch or over dinner. If they have a question, make sure you're always listening for that follow-up question.
Yeah.
Because I've seen podcasts where they have a list of 15 questions and they don't deviate from that at all. They go straight to those 15 questions, and we miss so many things on what that person is telling.
Right.
So you want to be able to tell a story as well.
That's a good point in talking about. So one, as you've defined your target audience. So in that example, like you shared, if you're talking sports related, maybe it's to your audience of a football team, the context of your conversation is all going to be related to that. And even having simple things. So, when we've got tools up here, so for ourselves, bullet points and talking conversations here, that might be something to consider. Am I going to have a fully scripted podcast where I know word for word, verbatim, essentially like a teleprompter style, where I'm going to be just going on script? Or is it more of going to be a candid, open conversation where I've just got some bullet points here, whether that's on your phone, we utilize laptops here, and that's just referencing some talking places. But it does allow for the flow of conversation, coming up with new questions, and it's just going to make it more authentic when you're having that conversation on your very own podcast and platform itself. So in talking about being able to connect with your audience, that's one key thing there is knowing, okay, am I going to be scripted? Or am I going to be a little bit more off-cuff, but just with some talking points that I'm going to be able to reference throughout the conversation? Now, Johnny, we talked about this, is the importance of having a goal defined for what your podcast is intended to do. Whether that's going back to saying, okay, this is an entertainment podcast, an educational podcast, this is to highlight and feature a guest, or some other key pieces and parts of saying, what is my end goal out of this? So we talked a little bit about that. And Johnny, if you could share more on knowing, hey, what else could I get ultimately out of a podcast, whether I'm a business owner, I'm a guest, I'm a host? What are some of the things to consider in thinking about what is my end goal for my podcast?
Great question, Jerry. So that is an absolute huge factor. Why are you doing this? What is the whole purpose of you sitting here talking to the masses, right?
Right.
So, for instance, there are sometimes I want to generate leads. I want to make sure that I have people watch my show. I can generate leads indirectly or directly through this show. By highlighting others, what I found is I get leads indirectly because now I'm the influencer. Now I'm that connection piece. I'm that resource that people can go to, like, hey, Johnny Martinez, Jerry Sauceda, Justin Castillo, they know what they're talking about because they're highlighting these people that are out of the community. So am I generating leads? Am I just trying to influence somebody in a certain way? But we want to generate leads. We want to build credibility in our businesses. That's what I like doing too. Because two of the most powerful things in the world are a microphone and a platform. I've said it several times. So we have a platform where we can be able to talk to a lot of people. We're here in this studio, Jerry, but we're talking to each other, but people are watching this. So how powerful is that? How powerful is the video podcast platform? It is incredible how much this has grown, and it's incredible how much we've been able to reach people, not only here in New Braunfels, but worldwide, I would say. We got watchers from Japan, from Germany. I got military people all over the world watching this platform. So what are you trying to get? There's so many, that is a broad question, but it's very, it could be specific or it could be broad. There's at least 10 elements that I can come up with right now. Lead generation, credibility. Are you trying to build confidence? Are you trying to overcome a hurdle of you being nervous on camera? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to connect this audience with this audience? I mean, there's so many things that you can do. And you mentioned it earlier, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all these things merge together and they're able to connect your voice and your face to everybody.
Right, absolutely. So having a clear goal and knowing when I go into this, what am I expecting to get out of it? What am I expecting my guests to be able to get out of it? So it could literally be lead generation, brand recognition and awareness. It could be establishing your voice of authority on that topic or that genre that you're in. It could be from the standpoint of building confidence. Probably one of the top things that we hear from whether it's the host yourself or your guest coming on is being able to get confidence from being behind the camera, essentially doing a form of public speaking. It's also being able then to just take your branding to the next level through the process of repurposing. And so that is probably one of the biggest key takeaways we've seen from being able to produce a podcast, essentially is long form content, now that you can repurpose and use in so many different ways. Imagine being able to take this content now, put it on your website, put it on your social medias, turn into micro clips like Reels and Stories, TikToks, put it on a platform like YouTube, creating some sort of a teaching catalog where you can take all of your content and share with others. So there's so many different ways that you could say, you know what, this is the end goal for what my podcast is. Now, I think that brings us up to this valid point because with all the things that we've talked about, I also believe that this is one of the reasons why podcasters fail. So let's talk a little bit about that, Johnny. So something to be mindful of if you're considering creating, launching, or having a podcast of your own, what are some of the reasons why podcasters fail?
Another great question. I think podcasters fail because they don't have the consistency. You need to have 3 to 5 episodes, great episodes, where people can kind of binge watch a little bit and watch the progression. So I see podcasters that go in, do 3 or 4 episodes, and they get minimal viewers, and they just want to quit. This isn't working. I'm not that good. But really, you might really be good. It's just your branding or your marketing that's not getting out there. So consistency in these platforms is the key to success. You might, like for us, for instance, we started this about 4 years ago, and we just now, within the past year, started getting momentum where people are starting to look at us now as credible resources. And when you see us enough times, you're like, oh, okay, these guys are spitting out some great knowledge and some great wisdom, some nuggets that I can utilize as well. But if you're just going out there and you don't know your audience, you don't know what you're talking about, and you're just kind of, jumbled up all over the place, you're going to lose those viewers because people are going to be like, what am I watching here? I don't understand why we're talking about this topic when it has nothing to do with that.
Yeah. So to that point, let's touch on that, right? So considering the consistency, so what's going to be the cadence of your podcast? Are you looking to consider having your podcast where a new episode is rolled out weekly? Maybe it's once a month. Maybe every single day you've got a piece. Now, even from the standpoint of producing that, what is that going to look like? Are you actually coming into a studio or in your home where you're recording that segment and piece every single week? Are you doing batch production and recording, which is some of the things that we offer and do here, where you say, you know what, I am going to do a weekly podcast that's going to last 1 hour. So I'm going to take one dedicated day in the studio where I'm actually going to record all 4 weeks for that entire month, and I'm going to have 4 different guests. So some of those things are going to help you to be more consistent. As you mentioned, Johnny, lack of consistency, knowing the same consistent time, the same consistent place where people can find you, hear your message, and what you're going to have prepared. Lack of focus is also one of the things that we've seen in terms of the conversation. What is it that you're actually talking about? The flow of the conversation, having prepared questions for your guest, how to be a good host, are certainly some of the reasons why podcasts fell. The lack of promotion. So let's talk about that. What are some of the ways as a podcaster that you can also promote and market your actual podcast?
I think social media is a great way to market your social media. Sharing, putting your information in groups, having some snippets of your podcast, getting people to share your content, things like that. And what's great about our podcast is we not only have about an hour-long conversation, sometimes hour and a half, but we have these little reels that are teasers that kind of force people like, oh man, that sounds pretty interesting. I want to watch the rest of this podcast. So those are things that you can do to help promote your own podcast or help promote podcasts from other influencers as well. So to go back to your point about consistency, and some podcasts I've seen, Jerry, are 10 minutes, some are 30 minutes. Ours usually go about an hour, hour and a half, depends on the conversation. If we're having great conversation, we're not going to stop the conversation. We're going to keep going. We don't really have time constraints. I don't think we have time constraints, but there is no parameter that we have. But if you're just starting off, start off with a 15-minute conversation. Start off with a 20-minute, and you can progress to having a guest on there.
Right.
And you can do it to start off in your living room on a phone, because we saw that a lot during COVID and recently. People are just trying to get their feet wet and build that confidence and those intangibles, consistency, confidence, all these different things. So there is no perfect way to start, but you have to start, and you got to do something.
Right.
And reels are kind of short form podcasts, kind of in a way. It could be a minute, minute and a half on TikTok. I think you go 15 minutes. But just getting your purpose and your premise out there, your face, and in a consistent manner, I think that is a good way to start. And eventually you can graduate, and then you can come into a full-blown production studio just like this one.
Right. So promoting your podcast, using your own social media channels, using other voices to help promote that, getting out in your community, using other events that you're part of, whether that's, like I said, in the community, in a networking group, sharing with your guests to say, hey, cross-promote the feature that you're going to be on, and getting the word out there. So another one of the key reasons why podcasts or podcast episodes fell is for the lack of promotion. Something really, really important to talk about, and talking about reasons why podcasts fell, but why yours can also be a success, is the quality of the production of the podcast. So I want to incorporate our master behind the production table. Some of the key pieces and intangibles, like even for someone like myself, didn't probably consider or think about going into the production insights of a podcast. What we do for you here at CollabSpace Studios and having you well prepared, and some of the things you may not consider or think about, but also one of the many reasons why you see individuals say they started a podcast, were thinking of it, and then it really didn't go anywhere or did not work out is poor quality of production. So I want to invite JRock, Justin Castillo here to give us some coaching and mentorship on the side of production. So JRock, can you touch on some of the most significant or major pieces to consider when you're thinking about a podcast and the production part of it? What would you share some insights on someone considering or thinking about in getting that podcast launch and being successful?
Yeah, man. How's it going, everybody? So, yeah, I think what's great, what people need to understand is I think podcasting, like you said, you hit it right on the nail there as well about how being consistency is a huge part of it. But when you have a producer that's able to come in and actually, whether it's control these cameras like I'm about to do right now, you're going to be able to see a couple different cameras here. I mean, you can see you got them there, you got individual cameras, or even like a far out camera where you can see everything. When you have a producer that's able to do that for you, it kind of takes a lot off of your plate there. And a lot of podcasts, again, like you said, they don't last long because they're probably doing all the work. You know, to where here at CollabSpace Studios, we're able to bring in, again, whether it's the production side or coaching, and what we're talking right now, production is, we're able to set these cameras up. We're able to make sure you have the great mics. You make sure you have good sound. You have somebody like right now, as you've been watching this episode, sits back here and watches your sound, your video, and making sure everything's looking great and crisp. And I think the beauty of again, this type of studio work here, like you're able to see the lighting and again, the different camera angles. You see our setups, you see our backdrops. It really does make a huge difference. And when you're seeing that, you'll see a lot of podcasts today, which I really love, is like you don't have to be so proper in ways, but it's always good for you to have some sort of theme that you got going on for yourself, again, depending on the type of podcast you have. Podcast myself, Kick Rock's podcast, is more of a, and guys, I think what's crazy is I've been podcasting again for 3 to 4 years. I didn't know where my podcast was going, but I started, and now I know that I love to have a comedic podcast show. So multiple guests, having fun, things like that. But again, where am I seating? Where's this camera shot angle? How is that going to connect with the things that I'm putting out on my social media? You know, what type of clips am I putting out? And I think those are the things about the beauty about going and having somebody help you with that production side and give you ideas. You know, everybody has great ideas for what they want to do or talk about for a podcast, but when you have that additional producer or production, it just gives it that little extra. So I think that's the beauty about what we can do here with CollabSpace Studios and the production side with what we do.
Yeah, that's such a huge component and probably something that I would have neglected just going into thinking about having a podcast. If you're thinking, because it seems simple enough to think, I've got an idea, I've got a context, a concept for a podcast show, I'm just going to go out and do it. And realizing the production factor and what goes into it. So let's talk about some of the actual equipment or pieces in here, some of the core items and things. One of the big things that podcasts fail is lack of quality. And first, if you're talking about an audio podcast, I would hope you'd have quality audio. So JRock, what are some of the audio components that go into producing a podcast that we utilize here or make the sound great, sound as great as it does?
I think the big part of it is first, you know, making sure you have the equipment that you have, and we have the equipment that's able to give us that crisp sound and making sure, and again, trial and error type stuff, you know. But I think the beauty of what we've been able to have here, from the great products of Rode or any other products that are out there, you have to find what fits you. And again, like you said, is it a video? Is it an audio? But in this situation, like you said, audio, a lot of it comes from what it is that you were trying to do with that product. You know, we got these Rode the Rodecaster, and then there's other mixers that you can use and things like that. But we work with a lot of Rodecasters here, and that's what brings out that crisp audio and able to make sure that we. Obviously, if you're audio, you want to hear. You're not going to see no video, So I think that's the beauty of that.
So to give an example, I think if we're here actually producing, so some people know from a producer standpoint, so like literally live, I want you to adjust my own volume on this microphone so you can see for yourself. You may be thinking that you're talking in your podcast and you're doing just fine and people can hear you okay, and they may not really be able to hear you well. So directional microphones like we're using here, this is really important because I am talking directly into the mic. It's picking up everything that I'm saying. But if I'm turning my head over here and talking to Johnny and I'm saying over this, that's going to matter the quality of my microphone and what I'm using. And a lot of people don't consider some of those factors. We're using headphones for monitoring, so I can hear everything that I am saying. So I know if I'm like sitting too far back and I don't sound good here, and I can't hear Johnny, well then you know what? It's gonna come through here. I'm listening to exactly what the audience is listening to. Justin's being able to listen to that as well. So from your standpoint, JRock, you also know like, hey, something is off. The quality does not sound great. That's what our audience is gonna hear. So as a potential podcaster or having your show, those are some key intangibles. Let's touch on the importance of the quality of cameras. And now I know you may not need to have the production level of what we've got here, but what are some of the things, JRock, to consider in thinking about whether it's camera angles, shots? What are some of the important things that you think are worthwhile to share someone that's considering a new podcast?
And like you said, Jerry, it's not a big deal to use your phone, you know, or anything. But like you said, with the phone, just the phone, you don't know those things that you just talked about, whether you're away from the mic and things like that. So that's what's beauty about having this situation where you have these cameras. When it comes to cameras, I think the angle is big, and it has a big difference in it because, again, this is what you're putting out for yourself, your business, your platform, your podcast, what it is that you're doing. So angles are huge. Obviously, the color, as you can see in the different shots that you have here, Johnny and Jerry have different angles on them. And, of course, it depends on the lighting. As you can see, we have lighting everywhere as well, depending on what's going on. So that's another huge factor of the camera angles. And then also, what is it that your podcast is doing? As you can see here as well, the guys are obviously here, but you can see on the video, I had 3 guys in that episode, so you can see the different camera angle there, and then it was myself. You can see the different shots going there. So you can the camera angles are huge when it comes to what it is you're trying to put out, and it really makes a big difference too when people are watching it. Are they watching it on their phone? Are they watching on YouTube? Are they watching it on Spotify? Well, what is it that you're trying to put out there as well with that video? And again, that's where we go back to your angles and things like that. So
yeah, that's such a good point, man. And like you said, so the consumer, where are they consuming your podcast at, right? So if they are watching on their phone, if they're watching on the laptop, if they're listening audio while they're commuting, getting ready for their day and things like that, important to consider. So we touch on all of that because, again, we want you to be successful. One of the top reasons why certain podcasts aren't is the lack of quality. So having simple things like this considered, again, whether it's an in studio and being able to have the level of quality of equipment that we've got here, or just getting started, just being mindful of some of those things. We want to prepare you and put you in a good space itself. So as far as actually software, JRock, I'm curious if you can share some of that too. So the podcast production side of it, whether it's certain softwares that we use or places then where the podcast is actually streamed. Because I think that's probably one of the big questions. Maybe someone that is looking to produce a podcast is like, hey, how do I get my podcast on some of these big broadcast networks? How do you actually make that happen?
I think we personally here, we use 2 to 3 different softwares to be able to get your work in there, the actual episode getting recorded. So we use a program called vMix that can actually stream your podcast to, if we wanted to go live right now, we could be on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, things like that. We have the capability of doing that. We have the capability of actually phoning in somebody as well with vMix. So we're learning how to get to that part of it as well. But yeah, when we edit, we use different types of editing, from DaVinci Resolve to other people use Adobe, CapCut. So there's many different aspects of software that we're able to use here in the studio. And again, depending on the different types of packages that you pick with us as well, we're able to actually help you with that. I think one of the big parts, which y'all mentioned earlier, gentlemen, was the fact that people don't put their actual footage out. And I think that's really tough because podcasting does take a lot of work, from actually setting up your host to recording to, again, the production side. And then you have to distribute. We do all that work all the way down to some people having the issues with distributing it out there. So I think with the softwares that we have and everything, that the capabilities that we have here at CollabSpace Studios, we're able to push all that out there. So again, whether you want to come in and record, whether you want to come in and go live, we have that capability here at CollabSpace Studios, and that can just open up so many different doors for what it is that your platform is doing.
Yeah. And to that point, because it can sound like a lot, there are plenty of options and ways that you can grow and develop your own podcast. One, as Johnny alluded to, is just getting started. But I think you'll find with a lot of podcasts, where they're at now is not where they started.
Absolutely.
Right? So maybe it is just an audio podcast that is literally just a few minutes, and it's progressed over time to where it becomes guest-centric, maybe includes video. Now you're broadcasting it live on YouTube. So just getting started, growing some of that consistency, getting some of the intangibles or small pieces in place are going to be important to establishing a solid foundation. So now, pre-production and producing the podcast is one thing, but there's also post-production. And so post-production in your podcast is something that I think is easy because it's out of sight, out of mind, and especially if you're not the producer. So JRock, let's talk about post-production. When we're talking about post-production, what are some of the pieces or parts that you, from a producer standpoint, have to keep in mind as far as editing, producing, cutting the content, including sound clips, bites, intros, outros, all that kind of good stuff? What goes into post-production?
I think, I mean, with the experience that I've had from producing shows, wrestling shows, and entertainment events, I've been able to understand what it is a show should look like, or at least in my eyes, or maybe even whatever it is that you're wanting in your eyes for your show. But yeah, a lot of it does come with editing. I'm writing notes right now as I'm writing these, shooting this podcast, to make sure as I go through edit, to make sure that I remember key factors or cuts or things that I need to take out. So a lot of that does come a lot of work. I think a lot of people that don't go through an editing process understand how important that is and how long that process can be. So when you can come in here, which, we've seen a lot of people come in here and do it really well with the one-shot type podcast. That's great. I mean, everybody likes a perfect play or a perfect, situation. Does it happen all the time? No. But that's the beauty of us and what we do. We can edit your stuff. We can go into post-edit. What is it that you want to add to your podcast? Is there videos? Is there topics that you bring up that you want to show a photo of what it is that you're talking about? Those are the things that we're able to do and add into editing and the post-edit. Music of your liking. An intro video to intrigue your listener and your viewer to come in the moment they see that on the platform that you're watching. So a lot of those post edits can consist a lot. And again, maybe a situation happened with the audio. I can go in there and clean and fix certain things with the different types of way that we are recording. And when I do record, we usually get about 2 to 3 different forms of that recording. The audio separate, the video separate, the video and audio is together in a different way. So there's different ways for us to grab that content, and then again in post edit be able to change and clean and clear, or take away whichever it is that you want. So that post edit's a huge part of your podcast.
Yeah, it is a very significant part, and JRock is one of the best. But some of the things to consider that we kind of take off your shoulders, but is part of the process and making it look great. So again, that can be definitely a progression of where you start and where you're at and growing and developing your podcast over time. But post-production is a huge factor, and distribution of that content as well. That's one thing we've seen with podcasts is it's not maybe a lack of sometimes of actually doing it, but it's distributing the content and getting it out there where people miss the mark. So, Johnny, let's go back. I want to talk about this because this is really significant from a guest and a host perspective. We can talk about the value of being a guest and also the value of being a host of a podcast. So let's touch on being a host. First of all, you've been a longtime host now of your own podcast, but when you think about creating the podcast, you're not just creating it with the intention of maybe highlighting a topic of conversation, or you just have a genre that you really enjoy, but there's a lot of value that comes into it as far as being the host of the show. So can you speak on that, the value of being a host of a podcast?
Absolutely. So about 4 years, Jerry, I had no idea that I had this skill to be able to come on a podcast and speak to the masses like that. But I've been doing it so long. When I mean doing it so long, I've been conversing with people so long. So when we were kicking around the idea of doing the podcast, we were like, this is what we do on a daily basis. We build relationships and talk to people. And all of you out there watching, you do the same exact thing. We talk to people every single day, whether it be your kids, your spouse, colleagues at work, and you have these fun conversations, you have these intellectual conversations, so on and so forth. So why not do it on this platform? Mm-hmm. And so we discovered that, and we're like, holy cow, we're on to something. This is great. And so as a podcast host, I'm able to build a lot of confidence, not only with myself, but with my guests. I'm building relationships on the air. As I'm talking to these people, we're building and establishing a relationship. So I never thought I could do that before on camera, but we're doing it. And those of you out there watching, you can definitely do it. We all have the skill to do it. It's just the matter of getting out there, having the confidence, having the ability to start. So, and it helps me build credibility as a host and as an individual as well, and as an influencer in the community. So as a guest, it brings a whole set of intangibles to you as well. Mm-hmm. Jerry, we've had people come on here that have never even thought in a million years that they can come on a podcast and speak for an hour. But once they're done, they're like, wow, I never knew I can do that. And now they're walking around with their shoulders back, chest out a little bit. They're like, man, I just accomplished something that I never thought I can do. And now we see them starting their own, not only podcasts, but they're on social media now, talking on video, helping set their business on fire, meaning to the next level. They're doing all these things, and it all started by coming into the CollabSpace Studios, getting started with us, helping them build that internal flame that they didn't know they had. So being a guest is instrumental to your success as a business owner as well. And most of the time we have business owners, but sometimes we have influencers, we have coaches, we have boxers, we have all kinds of different musicians. They're not really business owners, but they do have a brand. And they go out there, and Jerry, it's a thing of magic, man, when we can see people get out there and progress after the fact that they're on our podcast. So I love it.
That's great, man. And so much value when it comes to being a host or a guest. And I can tell you this is like, everybody can have a business card. Everybody can have a website. Everybody can do that. And those were trends maybe that were infamous when they had their heyday. And here's the thing is, like, we're just on the cusp of being able to make podcasts the next really big thing. And so when you're able to be the host who gives credibility, voice of authority, you are able to be the connector of people and conversation. That's just going to elevate all the things that you're trying to accomplish. And being a guest, like Johnny mentioned, is now being able to be highlighted and put something on your resume that many other people don't. Being able to do it before somebody else does, being able to build the confidence of knowing that you can be a part of a platform like that and which you did not think you could before, and knowing that you've got something worthwhile to speak about, whether it's your story, whether it's your product, whether it's your service. So there's so much value in being a host of a podcast and being a guest on a podcast. We would highly encourage both of them.
Yep. And Jerry, one great thing that we do here at CollabSpace Studios is we have mentorship and coaches that are able to help you grow not only that confidence we speak about, but growing your brand as well. So we sit here and we talk to you before you get on camera, and we talk to you about what your theme is going to be and what your premise is going to be, and your intro and all these different things, and we help you literally to level up, not only internally, but with your brand as well. So myself, yourself, and JRock, we're all coaches and mentors here that have been doing this a little bit. And it's a beautiful thing when we're able to do that and help people. And they're like, wow, this is great. Thank you guys for helping us. And that's just something that we love doing. We're trainers, we're coaches, we're mentors, and we're genuine when we want to help people to grow. So that's just an extra tidbit.
Coaching and mentorship goes a long way. The learning curve, I can assure you, is going to be really quick and short. So that confidence that comes with it, the experience, is going to go by really quickly. And you're going to see that your podcast is going to not only launch, but be successful, stick with some of the coaching that we've shared. And that's exactly what we're here for.